Hey everyone, Lou here. Today I just want to kind of go over my complete Warlock guide, specifically for Affliction, and just kind of tell you guys everything that I think a beginner and intermediate Warlock should know, with some advanced things along in there for people who are, doing Mythic content or pushing hierarchies and stuff to get better. So hopefully this is helpful for everyone, and let's get started. So first of all, I'd say, let's talk about the strengths of Warlock. So Affliction right now is really, really powerful in single target. Specifically because Haunt is really strong. Gives you 10% damage. You get extra damage from your Shadow's Embrace, which is another 9%. So, this is pretty much single target, sometimes two target ability. Otherwise, it's pretty impossible to keep up on 3 or more targets. So we just have a lot of damage amp. So that's really strong. UA does a ton of damage now, and it lasts really long. But once again, it's a single target ability because it can only be cast on one mob at once. So single target wise, Affliction is super strong right now. We also have a lot of mobility right now, being Night Fae, between Gateway, Demonic Circle, and just the Night Fae teleport. And there is a Soulbind you can use here, Demonic Momentum. So every time you teleport, you get a burst of movement speed, which is pretty helpful in some fights also. So we just have a lot of mobility right now. Probably the most mobility a Warlock has ever had. So that's another pro. I guess a major con would be we don't have AoE, right? We don't have a traditional AoE ability like a Rain of Fire, like a Flame Strike, or a Starfall, etc. We have Malefic Rapture. I guess you could say Seed, but Seed is pretty limited. Even with Sow the Seeds, you can only get it onto 3 targets, so it's just a pretty limited ability overall, even with Vile Taint and such. Just the way our kit works, we're a pretty single target class. So, that's why we're kind of not brought to keys as much, because we don't have that big burst AoE. Like a Boomkin or Fire Mage or Hunter would have. So that's kind of the pros and cons. Overall, Warlock is in a really good spot right now. Just because you don't have a burst, you don't have that crazy burst class like everyone else does. It's still really strong single target, and it definitely has its place in Mythic Plus and such. And it's really, really good at this tier for raid because there's a lot of single target encounters. So kind of going over talents real quick. This is our default single target talent setup. There are certain fights that you might just want to run Absolute Corruption, but other than that, this is pretty much the only build we'll get. Really isn't too many fights where you take Vile Taint or Dark Caller. Yeah, so it's either Absolute Corruption or Siphon Life. There are certain fights where Corruption is easier. Council, it's easier. Denathrius, it's easier. But it is a DPS loss. So if you can play well and you can manage all of your dots and track everything and keep a good uptime on everything, Siphon Life is the play pretty much on almost all fights. Besides maybe maybe Sun King and probably Stone Legion on you could use Absolute Corruption. Other than that, I use Siphon Life on pretty much every other boss. So we'll get into the rotation. So rotation changes based on what trinkets you have, right? So with the 1 minute badge, you always want to use your Soul Rot and your Phantom Singularity together with your trinket, since it's a 1 minute cooldown. The downside to this though is over time, while holding the cooldown, so you lose 1 cast of Phantom Singularity. Technically, but depending on fight length, you might be able to use Phantom Singularity right before the boss dies, dump all your soul shards, and then the boss will die before your soul rot comes up. But if you do have a 1 minute PvP badge, basically this is the rotation: Haunt, UA, open up your dots, drain to 3 stacks, Dark Soul, Soul Rot, Phantom Singularity, Dark Glare, dump shards. And the time you dump shards, Your haunts will be up. You can just refresh that. Refresh your other dots in 5 or 6 seconds. You know, just keep dumping shards while your Phantom Singularity is up. And then once your Phantom Singularity and Soul Rot are gone, your rotation is literally just drain the boss. And refresh dots. When you get to around 4 shards, then you might want to spend 1 shard just so you don't overcap. And you're just waiting basically for your Soul Rot and Singularity Trinket to come back off cooldown. One thing to note in terms of like efficiency, you can refresh your UA and your haunt, or your UA and a dot at the same time, right? So my Siphon Life's dropping off here, so is my UA. So I cast UA and then I quickly cast Siphon Life, and they refresh at the same time. Same thing, I'll cast my haunt and then my corruption. If fast enough, they refresh in like the same global, basically, so you don't waste any globals. So here, you know, everything's back up again. I hold my shards, and it refresh my dots here. But basically just do this, keep everything up. But if you're keeping track of your Soul Rot timer, basically, you just want to wait till then, and you want to refresh your dots right before your drain cycles or your Mythic Rapture cycles and such. It's pretty standard. So if you don't have the PvP badge, say you're using a 3-minute trinket or you're using the bell, you know, Cube's pretty popular, Dark Moon Deck, Vessel, Imperial Ordnance, all these are really popular trinkets that you can use. So say you're using a not 1-minute trinket. So basically your rotation changes. It is pretty much the same. Your opener is the same, you know, UA into Haunt, Dots, Soul Rot, Trinket, Phantom Singularity, Dark Soul, Dark Glare. That is all the same. However, your filler type of rotation changes. So, you know, I get all my dots up. So let's say right now my Soul Rot was on cooldown, right? So I have 3 shards, or 4 shards. I would spend 3 shards here on my Phantom Singularity. Right? I'd refresh on my dots. Let's say my Phantom Singularity, or my Soul Rot is coming off cooldown right now, right? Then, boom, I just dump in another 3 shards. And then I just kind of refresh dots, maintain drain until my Phantom Singularity comes up. So pretty much you just kind of want to use your Soul Rot and Phantom Singularity on cooldown if you don't have a 1-minute trinket. You could also save all your shards for Phantom Singularity. You could save 4 shards for same Phantom Singularity and just kind of use Soul Rot on cooldown and use like 1 or 2 shards. I don't like that as much. You don't get as much value from the mastery buff because every time you Soul Rot, you get 8 stacks of the mastery buff from Nia here. So every time you use it, you get 8 stacks. So that's pretty much how the rotation changes. Basically, if you don't have the 1-minute trinket, you just want to use Soul Rot and Phantom Singularity on cooldown with that minimum 3 shards. Just to clarify that. In terms of soul binds, so we're always playing Nia. Dreamweaver is actually a DPS loss for Affliction. The mastery is too strong, and it is always taken. So next week, when we are renowned 25, we can actually take in another potency, but ultimately when we're level 30 renowned, we're going to swap to this row and get the endurance conduit, and then the Nia's tools, the burrs, because the burrs are actually stronger than our second potency. And the reason for that is the Affliction potencies aren't very good. They aren't really DPS increases. Roll and Agony increases your agony duration, you know, that's like a quality of life. Lower cooldown on Dark Glare, it's also kind of a quality of life thing. Probably good in Mythic Plus, but in terms of like single target, DPS boost, it's not very good. Extra Soul Rot damage, you know, it's okay, but it's probably not better than the burrs. And Cold Embrace, which is most likely the trait that we would be using here. In that meantime, till we get Renown 30, is Cold Embrace. So it gives Shadow's Embrace pretty much like an extra 4% damage. So instead of it being 9%, it'd go to like 13-ish% based on item level. So it can go higher or lower depending on what the item level of the conduit you have. So pretty much the only one we're using here is Focus Malignancy. Malefic Rapture deals increased damage to targets suffering from UA. It's just a single target DPS increase every time Malefic Rapture. If you're curious on how I got 226, you can get it from a PvP vendor. If you are duelist rating, whatever rating you are in the bracket, you can actually just buy the conduit from the vendor for 200 conquest and get that. I believe the 200 is like 21%, so an extra 3% damage to Rapture here. Here I use Fell Celerity, mostly for Mythic Plus. You can kind of use whatever. Demonic Momentum's really good for raid, just like the extra boost. It's also good in PvP in some situations. Shade of Terror, pretty good in PvP. Fell Celerity I use for Mythic Plus. Swift Patrol is actually pretty nice because in Mythic Plus when you kill stuff, you just move around faster. For Endurance, the Diabolical Bloodstone is pretty good, just extra leech. It's really strong. It happens a lot. People are healthstoning constantly in raid. People are using a lot in Mythic Plus, so that's kind of my go-to. Second potency here for next week and the following week, I'll be using Cold Embrace, just for the single target DPS boost. And then eventually when I hit renown 30, I will swap to the Burrs, unless it's like heavily nerfed, which based on how much attraction it gets, it might get nerfed, but I guess we'll see. In terms of second endurance conduit, probably just use the Drain Life one for extra survivability. It's pretty nice. It gives you like a hot after you drain life. Pretty good in PvP, and if you get a big soul rod off in Mythic Plus or something, and you need to regen life, and you drain all of them, you get a pretty nice dot heal, so that's cool. Covenant, obviously, we're Night Fae. Guess the other only somewhat viable choice would be Kyrian, but I mean, pretty much everyone I know is Warlock is Night Fae, because it's just the best, and nothing really beats Soul Shape here. So, talked about rotations, so talked about single target talents, so now I'll go into kind of Mythic Plus. For Mythic Plus, there's a couple different builds you can use. Some people do Vile Taint Dark Collar. I don't like that too much. I like it in some dungeons. Like, I will use it in, for example, like Calls of Atonement, I use it. Just because there's a lot of trash packs. You're like constantly pulling big. It's okay in Mists because there's not too many bosses, so you don't really need the single target as much. You're just kind of doing big pulls the entire time. But that's pretty much it. Normally, this is my standard setup. Haunt, Phantom Singularity. So, I just prefer the single target. Kind of like I said earlier, you know, Warlock isn't the big burst AoE class, and you know, when it comes to damage, we're never going to do more damage than a Boomy or a Fire Mage or a Hunter on a massive AoE pack, really, like if they're playing correctly. So like, kind of prioritizing for single target, you know, killing Pridefuls, killing the big mini bosses, Theater of Pain, just killing bosses in general, killing the really big, tough mobs that really kind of kill your tank in this expansion. Necrotic Wake, the third boss room, ton of single target required to kill those abominations and such. Halls of Atonement, those big rockmen that you have to kill for the first boss. Stuff like that. There's a lot of big stuff in Spires, there's the squad leaders. Sanguine Depths, there's the Overseers and like a couple of the gargoyles and stuff. So there's just a lot of big mobs throughout the dungeons. And I like kind of just being that specialist in killing those big mobs. And I think that's where Lock can bring a lot of value to a Mythic Plus group. So that's kind of like what I do. In terms of rotation for AoE, you obviously want your tank to get everything pulled, so you only have to cast Seed one time. So once the tank gets kind of everything clustered together, you Seed, UA, put up like 4 to 5 agonies, you know, however many is in range. You drain your primary target, put a haunt up in your primary target once everything's grouped up, Phantom Singularity, Soul Rot, cooldowns, etc., and then just Malefic Rapture, right? As your agonies are falling off, you want to keep refreshing them so you can continue blasting Malefic Raptures. As stuff's getting low, you know, drain it for shards. In terms of affixes, Warlock's pretty good at most of them. Like, for the seasonal, it's pretty good for Prideful. We can kill the explosive orbs now with Corruption, because Corruption does damage when you apply it, like right away. So you can kill the explosive orbs. Spiteful is nice because we can drain the orbs, or we can drain the mobs for extra shards if we don't have any, since they spawn so often. Stuff like that. Tyrannical Week, obviously we're good. Killing bosses. Boss fights last 3+ minutes normally on hierarchies, so just having that single target really helps in that. In terms of gear, like overall gear, our best legendary is Demonic Synergy, which just gives you 10% more damage basically. It procs pretty often, probably 50+% uptime, maybe 60% even. So it's just really, really strong. I guess some alternatives that some Warlocks prefer is extra Agony Shards. I don't recommend this legendary, mainly because shards are not an issue right now. Maybe it's because I have a high level of haste, I'm about 19%. But yeah, it's like not an issue right now. Every time I need shards, my cycles, like for my Malefic Rapture cycles, I always have enough shards. I always have 3+ ready to go because I'm not randomly spending them throughout the rotation or throughout the fight. So, yeah, I would just always recommend Demonic Synergy. I always recommend it on Helm. The reason Helm is because it just gives you the most main stat, right? Like some people can get it on shoulders, but you get more value out of the Helm when it comes in terms of stats, since it's going to be such a high item level. You could go for shoulders, it depends on the type of gear you're doing, or the content you're doing in your gear, right? But obviously the only boss in the raid that drops shoulders is the final boss, the Nathris, so if you're struggling to get shoulders, I mean, you could make that, but the Helm is definitely recommended with haste and mastery on it. In terms of stats, haste, mastery, crit, all really strong. Heavily favoring mastery. It doesn't really have a cap. No, not one that will reach really. I think it starts to DR around 1,000 or so mastery, around like the 1,100 mark, and then it'll become a little bit devalued. But like hitting that mark is pretty tough. You know, I need like almost another 300 mastery to hit that. So mastery, you want mastery on every piece of gear if possible. Haste and crit, you want a decent amount of haste. It may not sim the highest, but the reason why you want a lot of haste is just because it makes the spec feel good. Without a lot of haste, your dots can kind of fall off. Your drains might not tick fast enough to apply Shadow's Embrace. It feels like really slow and sluggish to try to maintain, you know, Siphon Life, Agony, Corruption, Haunt, UA, and then like trying to get enough raptures into your windows, burst windows and such. So having a 15+% haste, I'd say, probably higher up to that like 20% mark, makes the spec feel really good. Crit is pretty strong, like our dots crit more, and really it helps when it Malefic Rapture crits. The damage difference between a crit and non-crit is obviously pretty significant, so getting anything crit mastery, haste mastery is pretty good. The stats I'm using on pretty much everything is haste mastery here, haste mastery here. Here I'm just waiting to get the Shriekwing boots on Mythic, which are crit mastery, but they just don't seem to drop ever. Haste mastery here. Crit verse here, not the best, but aren't too many options really for belts. You can get the crit haste from Artificer, but Haste Mastery gloves, heavy mastery on your weapon, heavy mastery on the wrists, crit mastery here, burst mastery here, haste mastery, haste mastery. So as you can see, like, I have a very limited amount of verse, you know, only when I really can't avoid it. So like PvP, shoulders, I can't really avoid it. And then the belt, and then the boots will eventually be replaced. But those kind of like the stats that you want. Just crit, haste, and mastery. Mastery being first, haste being second, crit being pretty close to haste, but I'd put that third. In terms of like Enchants Gems, everything, just mastery. For cloak, it kind of depends. I use the leech. I just like leech better, especially with the soulbind. Extra leech is nice, so it's like 18% total, which is pretty significant when you're like doing pridefuls and such in Mythic Plus, and it's also pretty useful in progression when you're just taking like big bursts of damage. Chest, I use Internal Insight, and for weapon, I use Celestial Guidance. You could use the Sinful. It's pretty good, and it's probably better on single target, on pure single target, but on any time there's more than one target, Celestial Guidance for the extra int buff is just overall better. In terms of second trinket, I use this one just because it's a super high item level. Extra haste, extra int, always good. Everyone else, you know, if they're not using the PvP trinket, they're using Unbound Changeling, which, you know, gives you a mastery proc or a haste proc depending on what you need. Pretty much kind of like the two options when it comes to overall passive and one on use trinket. I guess one thing to note about the Unbound Changeling is the stats actually change based on the food that you eat, right? So once I get the well-fed food buff here, this trinket should change to a haste proc. And boom, just like that, it is now a haste proc. So you can make it a mastery. It took me a little while to realize this is a thing, but if you need a mastery proc or a haste proc instead, then you can just eat a food buff and it will change it. I don't know if there's a cooldown on it. Let's see here. Will it change it back? Yes, it will. So you can literally swap it whenever you need to. I see I just swapped it from haste to mastery there. But that's a lower item level one, so I use the 226 instead. If you happen to get lucky and get a 226 in your weekly vault, then you know, definitely pick that up. It's pretty good. Procs pretty often and such. Yeah, that is pretty much all I wanted to cover. Hopefully it was helpful for everyone. Hopefully, like, people learned a few things. If you have any questions, just ask in the comments. I can go into more detail and stuff. I will have more guides coming out for certain bosses. I'm mainly doing mythic bosses right now, but if you need help on like Heroic Sludge Fist, Stone Legion, or Sidon-Athreus, I can also do a video on them and kind of talk about my cooldown uses and such on them, if that is what people are interested in and need help with. But until next time, everyone, see you around.